Yeah.
And unfortunately. So I've put up, or the recording was loaded by Munir. The PowerPoints are there as well. I would just ask that you use them in some ways as a supplement to the reading, because I can't have all of the information on those slides. So it's kind of use it as a guide for like key points that would be important for you to like know, understand, kind of reflect on. And I will post for next week, August 5th. Let's see. Yes. So for those who are in Professor Tahira's class, you do not have a class next Monday, the 5th. Is that right? Okay. So we will go back to our Monday, which was the regularly scheduled time. And then the following week, that will be, which is August 12th, that will be a question that I will put in the forum. And so we won't have the class. I will actually be out of the country as well. And so what I've asked is that you respond to the prompt and then to at least one other person's response. So those instructions will also be sent to you. Okay. How's everybody doing with the second reflection paper, The Shape of Daily Life? How's that coming along?
It's okay.
It's okay. What does that mean?
Well, just haven't had time to sit down and write my daily reflection.
You said you don't have time to sit and write your daily reflection?
I didn't. I haven't had time to do it. I'm done with work and everything else. I'm just kind of feeling exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to what I was saying last time: managing time, better time management.
Mm-hmm.
So what is? It's in my mind. I just have to write it down.
Okay. So what is that telling you?
I don't know. I need to take the time. I need to take the time and focus on myself.
Yes. Does anybody else want to respond? What is that? What might that be an indication of?
Procrastination.
That might be.
Or fear. I don't know.
Okay, it could be that. It could be perhaps that you're doing too many things at once, which is one of the things that we'll talk about, as we continue the discussion of rest in the storm. And that it could simply be, just even the notes function on your phone. As you start each activity, whether that's, say it's 7:05 a.m. and you're leaving your home to go to work, writing that down. Do you have a morning meeting? Do you have to meet with someone? And so it could be, very simple as far as making a note of each task as you begin. Okay. And has anyone ever, for maybe like physical health reasons, or, maybe you're having surgery and they said, okay, you can't eat past 10 o'clock p.m., right? And you can only have this, right? And so sometimes, even when people are being tested for allergies, they ask that you write down everything that you eat, right? And so one of the sort of I guess, consequences or outcomes of that kind of activity is becoming just more aware of what you consume, of what you do. And so that's also a part of this assignment, right? Because often, even when we say, well, I don't have time to do something, we each get 24 hours in a day, right? So how we allocate that time, part of what the reflection is asking you to do is, are we being intentional with our time, especially because it's finite, right? And so are we feeling compelled to do certain activities, or are we actually thinking about, this is what I've said, this is the portion of time that I've set out to do this task. So if you're feeling like you don't have time or you're juggling too much, that might be a sign that you're doing too many things, right? And so perhaps not everything gets completed in the way that you intend, right? But something is happening, right? And so it's part of the exercise. Remember, we talked about content versus process. Part of it is, are we paying attention to where we're allocating our time? And if it's being done in a way that feels reactive, right, then that forces us to really think about, am I engaged in activities that I don't find interesting, compelling, satisfying? Am I engaged in certain activities because I feel obligated, and then I feel resentful, right? And so when we think of a moment, right, when you thought to yourself, this person, this activity, this fill in the blank is wasting my time, right? We've all felt that at some point. Am I right? Or is that just me? Right? We've all perhaps felt that way. And so what was it about that particular experience that made you feel like it was a waste of your time? Is anybody willing to share?
I can share. Salam everyone. So for me, sometimes just lack of accountability over the time being asked, or the time I'm the time that let me give the context. So I work in IT, and every once in a while someone will come and they have some big thing they want me to work on, but they don't have any notes written down. They don't have a proper schedule set. They're putting a lot of pressure on me to just do all of this, and it's okay if it's after hours, even though I don't get paid overtime or anything.
Mm-hmm.
So things like that. So that's when they might have a really nice nonprofit intention or something, but if the other person is not coming organized and respecting my own time, then it seems like it's a waste of time for me, because I'm trying to get it out of their mouth, basically. What are you trying to tell me? What do you want me to do? So that's my example.
Okay. And so when you're in that moment, how are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty exhausted. I'm feeling because it happens regularly, I'm feeling mad at the person, and the issue for me is something there's usually a big age gap. So say if it was someone closer to my age, I'd be come on, get yourself together, write this down. But because there's 30 years between us, I feel like I feel like I'm way more accommodating and gentle than maybe I should be.
Okay.
Maybe.
Okay, that's fair. And so when you feel that, part of it, you said, being upset and frustrated, I think also feeling as if you're not appreciated. Would that be accurate?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So not feeling appreciated, but also feeling as if there are other ways that you could have spent that time, and now you can't reclaim it, right? So once it's spent, and this is, again, goes back to kind of intentionality and purpose, because we can't live without limits, and we know that it's very difficult to, it's not like time can be recycled, right? You can't say, you know what, I just want to do over, right? That 5 or 10 minutes or 20 minutes that I spent was not actually the way that I wanted it, to unfold. We can't do that, right? And so this is when we start to think about where we allocate time, how purposeful we are in doing so. That will also, what we're going to get into in kind of reviewing some of the aspects of rest in a storm, is how we say no, right? How many of us, and I'm including myself in this, have struggled with saying no, right? And in some way, we might have all, had moments where we felt like we were better at this than others. But part of the kind of the metaphor of the rest in a storm is knowing when we can recognize and honor our limitations, right? And so I want to go back to the beginning of talking about, Jones talks about this idea of self-violence, right? And lack of a personal accountability, denial of our own personhood. And when we're doing that and not able to say no, or feeling as though you have to deprive yourself of the ability to set that boundary, how are you elevating yourself, right, to the status of God or of gods that can do without limit, right? And so recognizing, what are my limitations? That's part of the process of self-awareness. But also knowing, I was looking over, and I had to underline it. Let's see, when you say no, he calls it the big, small word, right? Our challenge is also to remember, this is on page 41, that just because we're asked to do something, and just because we can do something, no matter how laudable the task, that capability does not mean we ought to accommodate that request, right? We have the right, and sometimes even the obligation, to say, no, thank you, right? Moreover, our no opens the way to someone else's yes. We inadvertently sabotage leadership opportunities or development in our churches, for instance, when we monopolize service opportunities, right? And so again, that goes back to these three barriers, right? To being in the back of the boat, or knowing when we can set the boundary, set the limit, and be very aware of how we're using our time. And this is why I really encourage you to jot down how, whether it's, on the hour, what are you doing, right? Are there certain patterns that you might not be aware of had you not sort of engaged in this activity, right? Because you might also find that there are hours where perhaps your body is forcing you to take a break, right? And so why not just build that in, right? It could be, does everyone know when they're most productive? How many of you are like morning people, right? You love being up in the morning, okay? Sazia. How many people sort of like come alive in the afternoon? Yeah, I'm more of an afternoon person. And so even structuring your day, right? Are you going to schedule very activities that are going to require a lot of mental energy for the morning when that's not your best time, right? I would say no, right? If you are a morning person, then you might want to sort of schedule those tasks that will require the most of you during those times, right? So it's saying, I'm recognizing my limitation, I'm recognizing the boundaries that I have set and my own capacity, right? And I'm structuring my day accordingly. And so as a leader, as an advisor, right, you're also modeling for other people that they can also say that I have limitations, right? I have, finite capacity. And so as you lead, you're able to set an example of what it means to kind of be human in this role, right? But if you're seen as somebody who's like always on the go, you set, the pace really fast, right? then the folks behind you are going to be like, I'll catch you when if you've been on a track or you know anything about sort of track and field, when you lap someone, right? And so they're going at a slower pace and you've already made the rounds, right? One of the conclusions that they may draw is that they're a disappointment to you, right? Or why can't I do as much as this person when what you're doing may actually not be sustainable, right? So you're setting a pace that may be very difficult for others to follow. And so when you realize that, right, do you slow down? Do you take a look behind you? Do you say, you know what, perhaps I need to figure out what is the slowest pace of the folks that I'm serving, right? And am I accommodating of that, right? Can we negotiate such that I slow down, but they also kind of pick it up a little bit, right? So these barriers of the myth of our own indispensability, right? Which means someone can replace you, right? We often don't want to think about that because they're like, no one can do this the way that I can do it, right? Also invincibility, and then the denial of our own personhood, okay? So getting to the back of the book, any questions or comments or anything that kind of stood out to you as you were reading about just being able to practice saying no? Yeah, Tanya.
I was just going to say, specifically with what you were sharing about being a night owl versus like a morning person, it's been an interesting journey for me because I've always been this way ever since I was a child. My mom just always said, you wouldn't really perk up until like after 11 a.m. And then you would always be like going to bed really late, like ever since I was a child. And I see this in my daughters as well. And so I used to think that I was somehow not as good as of a leader, or that I wasn't called out for ministry because I couldn't live into the patterns or the lifestyle that I would see other clergy were like. They would rise early and they would have their devotion time in the morning and they would go for a walk. And so I think it was very, it was profoundly healing for me to be able to recognize that that's just how my biological clock is. It doesn't mean that I'm lazy or that I don't have a disciplined spiritual life. It just means that, and I actually saw an article recently about how 10% of the population, their circadian rhythm is actually like supposed to be as a night owl. That's just how people are born. And having your internal clock adjusted to live into the morning, person's lifestyle can actually, drastically affect your mood. And, you see people who suffer from depression because they're living into something that they are not. And so I had to kind of accept for myself that I am called to lead and I am qualified and I am equipped because I've been doing the work, and my spirituality is no less spiritual because I pray at 3 a.m. or because I'm still up catching up from what I need to do and finding the time for my personal sacred time, when it's not like, oh, I was up at sunrise to pray. And it's like, no, I'm sorry. I was catching my third sleep and I don't wake up until like 9 when I feel really good. So just that was really important for me. It seems silly, but I really needed to kind of let go of the idea that in order to be the best kind of spiritual leader, I needed to fall into this pattern that other leaders kind of, whether or not they planned on it or not, they kind of set that example. And
right.
I think that's what makes good leadership and what makes kind of the human tapestry so beautiful, is that we're all so different. And trying to live into something that you're not is just going to keep depleting you. So.
Absolutely. No, I wholeheartedly agree. I think it's once you are able to, and I don't even want to call it a limitation, but just who you are. And part of, is acknowledging partly the context that this idea of productivity, right, is around kind of Western capitalism and how much can you produce, right? And that being set at between this hour and this hour. We also see it at times in education, right? When, especially for high school students, when they're at school at 7 to 8 in the morning, that's not when they're most productive.
Right.
And then they're penalized because they're tired and they're still trying to figure out their own rhythm, their biological clocks. And so there are some schools that have adopted a later start time, right? And they're like, yeah, we get more participation because they're actually awake. And so it's, I think, acknowledging kind of your personal preferences, your style, and again, thinking about how do you maximize your limited capacity, right? It's a lot to do with that idea as well. Any other comments?
I just wanted to ask, I left the meeting at times. I had some breaks in the internet connection, but the activity that you talked about of jotting down your, your activities on the hour, can you just rephrase that? Because I missed the introduction to that.
So that is the second reflection, the shape of daily life.
Mm-hmm.
So the assignment was over the course of a week to keep track of how you're spending your time and in particular ways. And so writing down what you're doing, but then the assignment was to assign a value to that task. Like, was it something that is depleting you, something that you enjoy, something that nourishes you? And then over the course of the week, you'll start to see a pattern, right? And so it might be a question of, is your fatigue, let's see. Okay. So is it an activity that boosts your energy, something that drains you, something that's kind of neutral? And in the areas of work, perhaps daily tasks, relationships, self-care, and then other, right? And so it's also thinking about those times where you say like, oh my gosh, where did the time go? It could be just, activities that consume the little time we have and we don't know it, right? And so social media is a good kind of just hole for that, right? If you're on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and you look up and you've been kind of scrolling or posting or doing something for like a half an hour, right? And you're like, oh my goodness, that's not what I had.
Or an hour.
Or an hour. I mean, really, like it can consume a lot of time if we're unaware, right? And so it could be, do you give yourself an allotted time, right? That, maybe you want to catch up with what friends are posting or saying or things like that. But it's really about kind of being intentional and reclaiming the way that we use time, because we don't have, right, an infinite amount of it, right? And so even when people use the phrase like, time is money, right? It's like, where are you spending your money, right? And if you're the most valuable sort of resource, right, and it's finite, then how are you making the best use of it so that you're effective? Okay.
Professor, I just have a follow-up question to that.
Yes.
I've been kind of jotting, because the week that you suggested for us to track was kind of not a normal week for me. I'm still currently doing it now. I started when I got back from my trip.
Okay.
Were you wanting us to include that as part of the paper, like the way that we tracked it, or is that really just for us to pull different sections to write about? Because I've been just doing like in a note on my phone, just like by the hour, kind of what activity I've done and if it's work or family or leisure related or home stuff. But I haven't like done any detailed notes about like what value I assigned to it or was it draining. I've kind of just been trying to keep track for now to look at the pattern. So
Right.
if you wanted more details, like I want to make sure I go back before I forget how I felt about that.
Okay. Yeah. So
I guess, yeah. Was it to be included in the paper or just anecdotally we take from our notes and then write about it?
So I would suggest using the table as a
Okay.
format. And so it could be, that you give the example of a day or two, right?
Okay.
But I think in the table format, right, it'll be visually easier to see how the time is being used, right? And so in the example, say on any given day, this example on page 13, puts in like sermon prep, committee work, yard work, like daily tasks being yard work, cooking, cleaning, laundry. And so if you're thinking about, say you're up at 7 a.m. and you're in bed by 11:30, right? Even that's a pretty long day. But seeing it visually broken down in the table will help you sort of identify more quickly where there's like waste, right? Or do you see yourself getting pulled into activities that you hadn't scheduled, right? When if you're in your office, right, and you're working, you're like, hey, this is my to-do list and I prioritize, and someone says, hey, Tanya, you have a second? You're like, oh no, right? That could easily be 30 to 45 minutes.
Oh, I gotcha. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Right? And so, yes, certainly keep track of if it's something that boosts your energy, right? It says put a plus and then a minus if it drains you. Because then again, you'll also be able to visually see if you're engaged in activities continuously that drain you, that's a pattern that you have to pay attention to.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about that? Okay. So I want to get into some of the concepts again that were raised in Rest in the Storm. Okay. And again, the metaphor being, when do you allow yourself or give yourself permission to take respite? And on page 39, Jones talks about acceptance being the first sort of step to take, right? And allowing yourself respite, believing that you also deserve it, that you're can be a person who can be overwhelmed by the demand of the service that you're providing to others, and what might get in the way of that acceptance or recognition. And he says on page 40, our sense of personhood and professionalism seems to demand that all requests are accepted and satisfied. Many of us are held in bondage to distorted definitions of self and service that are fixated on endless doing and giving. Okay. Our challenge is to remember that just because we are asked to do something, which is what I said before, doesn't mean you have to say yes, right? If someone asks something of you, do you find that you have like a knee-jerk kind of like, oh, yes, of course, that's fine, I'll get it done, right? How often do you respond that way? Maybe more often than you should.
Too often.
Yeah. What did you say?
Like too often that you're just ashamed to admit that that's the truth.
Right.
Yeah.
And so one of the, there was actually, this point was made in some of the reading around emotionally healthy spirituality is like, in what ways are you overcompensating, right? What is the fear that you're avoiding by saying no, right? It's, I'm fearful that people won't need me anymore. I'm fearful that they'll be upset with me. I'm fearful that, I won't be able to prove my worth if I say no, right? And so it's identifying what is the worst that can happen, right? And often the person will be resourceful and find another alternative, right? But if you're wed to this idea of indispensability, that you're the only one that can complete it, and that this is sort of a sign of your worth. So while you're exhausted with the demand, it's also like, oh, I feel needed, right? And we can really become at times enamored with the feeling of being needed and in demand, right? But it leads to depletion, self-deprivation, and denial of personhood. Okay. The other, I think, point is that we have to plan these times where we're going to take respite, right? They won't be granted to us. You know, the folks around you typically will continue to ask if you continue to say yes, right? They don't know that you're juggling 50 different tasks. You know, they're like, oh, that's great. You said yes, you can do it, right? Wonderful. But if you say, you know what, I really would like to help, but I got a few things that I have to do right now, so I'm sorry, right? I'm not going to be able to complete that, right? Again, what is the worst, right, that you're fearing the person might say? You know, I sort of tested this today with my daughter, right? We have a lot that's happening, and she's getting ready to go abroad, and I'm finishing up internship and all of that. And she wanted a friend to come over for the weekend, right? And at first you know, Mom, I wanted to say, yes, of course, have her come over, right? And I thought about it, and I said, the best thing for me to say is no, right? That there are other things that we have to tend to this weekend, that saying yes to that request, right, might mean saying no to other things that might be a greater priority, right? And so what was the worst fear around that? Was she upset? Yes. Did she get over it? Yes. Right? And so she said, okay. And so in our own minds, we might be manufacturing, right, this response that we fear, right, when if the person is upset because we set the boundary, right, that also might give us information that we haven't done it often enough, right? So they're surprised, right? Well, you're like my go-to person. You always say yes, right? And they might not know that you're saying yes under duress, right? That the minute that, you know, they maybe poke their head in your office or say, send you a quick email, like, hey, you know, I really appreciate this. If you could help me out, right? What they don't see is that the minute that you accept, right, whatever request that is, now in your mind, you're like, now how am I going to do this? Right? I've already said yes, right? I can't go back on my word, right? Then it becomes about that. But what would have happened if you had declined to begin with? Right. So does that make sense?
I have a question about this.
Yes.
So maybe this is like a way of fooling myself, but sometimes I think that if we, like, okay, I'm just going to use like household chores for an example. Like if I do the laundry by myself, and if my friend who lives like a couple blocks down does the dishes herself, it feels overwhelming. But if I go over and help her do the dishes, we have a cup of tea, and then she comes over and we do the laundry together, it just feels better. That to me is like developing community, right? But the part that gets me is when you're always the one giving, and sometimes people don't realize that there's like a reciprocity, or, you know, it's like I find the people that give the most are giving so much because they're in need too. And I just wanted to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is what happens when there's a lack of reciprocity, right? In the relationship or in the giving or in the service, right? I think the first thing that we have to ask ourselves is, why have we engaged in a relationship in which there wasn't the reciprocity there, right? Established as a principle. And so this doesn't mean like we keep a ledger, right? Of like, I did this for you on this day, and now is your turn, because the reciprocity may look different. But I think again, the living without limits, right, sets the precedent that if someone says like, oh, I really appreciate this, and, and maybe they make a gesture, right? Do we accept it? Like, no, it's fine, right? No, like, I don't need anything in return, when we might, right? Whether that shows up as gratitude or a physical action, right? And so I would say the question that you might want to ask yourself is, do you have difficulty accepting help, right? Do you have difficulty asking for help? Are you fearful of disappointment, right? If you do ask and the person says, actually, no, I'm busy today, but I might be able to do it in the next couple days, right? Can we sit with their limitation, right? When we might have a need that we would like to have met. So I think when we feel a lack of reciprocity, it also sometimes is accompanied by a feeling of disappointment, or it's not at the level of resentment yet, right? But if it continues to happen, the pattern, we might feel that. And so we should first, I would advise, like, look inward and to think about, if I have sort of contributed to a pattern or a precedent in which maybe I block the person from reciprocating because I want to be self-sufficient and I don't want to feel obligated to other people. But knowing, like, deep down, we do need the kind of care that they're offering, right? Why are we setting up sort of obstacles to it? Does that answer your question? Okay. He also, kind of along those lines, in thinking about the sacred pace, and that begins page 49, thinking about what he calls a sacred pace as a living speed characterized by peace, patience, and attentiveness, right? And so what he describes as the contrast to caregiving or ministry, says one has us doing too much at one time, and then doing too much as fast as we can, right? And if we begin to pride ourselves on being like skilled multitaskers or really effective at sort of putting out multiple fires at a time, again, are you getting in the way of someone else being able to demonstrate competence, right? Because if you just say, oh, no, it's fine, I got it, right? Then they are going to take you at your word, right? But if you're saying, oh, no, I got it, and you want the other person to say, no, let me help, right? They may just say, oh, you seem to have this all under control, right? So I'm going to go. Right, I'm going to focus on something else. And so it's being aware of the pace that we set, whether it's, again, are we focused on the task at hand? Are we easily distracted? And are we just simply piling on too much at once? That could be the source of the issue. Controlling the pace of the response, Jones says on page 52, a great deal of the overload we experience is directly related to our inability to control the pace of our responses to life in general. As if all responses must be made as soon as possible, and as if all matters must be resolved with all speed, right? So again, going back to someone making a demand of you, do you allow yourself to say, you know what, let me check back in with you, right? Like, you don't have to agree immediately. Right? You know, I'm not quite sure if I can do that. So let me check back in with you in the morning. You know, this is, of course, if this isn't time sensitive. But if you feel the need to respond in the affirmative immediately, right, then that might tell you, or else, right? What is the fear? Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. So my question is, what gets in the way of maybe contemplating the types of requests or demands that people put on you. What gets in the way of being able to just pause before you agree or kind of rush to someone's aid?
I think for me personally, this is making me think a lot because it's something that I've been working on currently with my counselor in therapy, because I have this difficulty in saying no. And even when it's things that I don't want to do or that I know that that's not my strength, I'll say, oh, sure, let me just make sure there's nothing that conflicts. And I never pause to reflect or to really even think, like, is this something that I want to do or that I feel, most of the times I feel obligated to do it. And I think it stems from that fear that you're talking about, the fear of, I think also when we talked about homeostasis, it's like, it's a little bit easier to kind of just say yes and do something. Sure, even if you're not good at, you're resourceful and you'll figure it out.
Right.
Then it might be to disappoint people or to let people in on the fact that you really are human and can't do it all and you're tired. And I feel like it's not something that I've really addressed with my family yet, but I think that it also stems from this kind of coming from the margins. Like, I feel like because I'm a woman of color, I feel like somehow I have to work twice as hard to kind of prove that I deserve to be where I am and that I can lead and hold my own just as well as men or others. And I think that it's kind of, unfortunately, a lot of mixed causes. It's like I got that from growing up. Like, my grandmother taught me that, you're going to have to work twice as hard as everyone else in the room because no one is going to help you. And I think it's meant to be something to protect you from harm and just kind of set you up for like a battle, if you will. But it becomes kind of like once you've moved out of those, not completely out of those systems, but once you've found a way to kind of resist them and find your own voice and make your own path, it's hard to let go of those very early lessons that teach you that you have to say yes to everything that's going to push you forward and advance your culture, your people, because if you say no, that's a missed opportunity, and so you're not going to be able to change anything. Right. But then you're basically exhausting yourself at every turn, because at the same time that you want to give so much back and do the best that you can because of the privileges that you have now, it also ends up kind of harming you, because then you feel like you're never good enough and it's never going to be enough to prove to society or what it might be that you are strong and that you can do this and that you're, worthy of being seen as somebody who's worth being respected, etc.
Right. Absolutely. I think what I'm going to put also in the class resources is taken from the book called The Emotionally Healthy Woman, and it's in the series of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. But there's a chapter titled Quit Overfunctioning, right? And it reads, I'm going to pull it up now. Let's see. Okay, so we overfunction when we do for others what they can and should do for themselves. Overfunctioners prevent people, including themselves, from growing up, right? And so when we think about, let's see, what she writes as the 5 deadly consequences of overfunctioning. Overfunctioning breeds resentment, right? And so when you're constantly doing for other people, they might begin to take that for granted. And so not really appreciate what you believe to be your sacrifice They just take it, this is just a normal part of what you should provide, right? But for you, it's like, can't you appreciate just how much I'm giving to you, right? And they're like, no, because you do this all the time.
And then when you finally set up the boundary, then it's
Oh.
like, what? But you're always so helpful. It's like, oh, I'm trying to be healthier. That's what this looks like. I'm trying to be healthy now.
Yes. The other interesting thing is that she says is over-functioning perpetuates immaturity, right? The example that they use here is Moses was over-functioning leader who mistakenly believed that his self-sacrifice helped his people. Day and night, thinking about why are people arguing about this, but it's allowing. So here's another example. I do believe in giving even younger children like little chores, right? So even if it's like hang up your coat, put your shoes away, right? It's teaching them responsibility, right? So they can each get a task. And there are age appropriate sort of tasks that kids can be given. But what happens, and maybe you've either interacted with children, maybe you have a child like this, that believes that people should do everything for them, right? And so it's the assumption that others will cater to their needs always, right? And when we do that, perhaps we're just like, oh, he's tired or she's tired, or it's just easier for me to do it myself, right? What is learned is other people will meet my needs, right? So I don't have to work really hard at all, right? And so that again is how overfunctioning can lead to immaturity. The other, let's see, there were 5 consequences. Is thinking about when you do stop and say, there are things that I'm doing that might actually be counterproductive, right? It is acknowledging your role in a system, right, that has operated in a certain way. And so when we're understanding our limitations and people respond to it, right, it's also taking responsibility to say, they're upset, but I've also allowed myself to participate in this interaction in such a way, right? So can I really be upset that they're now like, wait, where's my help, right? Where did it go? And so perhaps responding to their surprise or to their dismay with the understanding that you're setting up a different way of relating, right? Which you can say, I believe you can do this. I believe you're just as competent, right? You just need practice, right? That might be the way to frame it. So on page 63, kind of going with the idea of breaking away from overfunctioning, Joan says, sign a peace treaty with conditions you cannot control, right? What is within your power to control and what is not? Like, do we have a clear sense of what that is, right? So I'm going to open up that question. Do we all have a sense of what is in our control and what is not?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so what are some of those things kind of generally you feel is within your control?
The manner in which I would respond to something, I think I have control in that aspect. And everything else is a crapshoot.
Okay. Right, especially when you're dealing with other people, right? You can't really.
Especially, yeah.
Especially, right. Here's an example. What do you do when you're sitting in traffic?
This is funny you mentioned this because today I had an incident in traffic. It was raining here, and like the lights were out in my house, so I'm actually at my parents' house right now. And I was in the HOV lane, which if you guys don't know what that is, it's like when more than one, you know, like the lane for multiple riders. Hang on. Honey.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's this car that was like tailgating me, and it's a very narrow lane, and it was raining really hard. So I like, my reaction was to like slow down even more just to get them to slow down. And then they put their high beams on, and and I took my hand out of the car, and I was like, you know, like, don't do that. Like, I was kind of like, you know, your lights. So then he turned them down, and then we both slowed down. And later on, there was like this immediate stop in the HOV lane. And because he had slowed down, he didn't crash into, he didn't hit me. Otherwise he would have.
Mm-hmm.
So I took my finger, I rolled my window down, and I was like, you know, I did one of those. My kids enjoyed it more than, I don't have no idea how he reacted, but that's how I am in traffic.
Yeah. And so, you know, part of it is, I feel like, you know, often there's like several different types of drivers, right? There's, you know, folks who are like trying to weave in and out of the lane, like to figure out which one is moving faster, right? And then what happens, and you know, when the person who's weaving in and out, and you're just kind of like moving steady, like, okay, this is just, it's rush hour, it's congested, there's not much I can do. When you meet that person at the same light, right? So for all of their maneuvering, you're at the same place, right? What does that tell you, right? And so when we're responding to things that are outside of our control, right? What can become even more exhausting is when we expend, again, finite energy and time resisting the reality of that, right? And so if you know that your commute is going to be, you know, if you take it often enough, you know those points of congestion, and then it opens up, and then maybe it's congested again. Do you take that, you know, time to maybe listen to a podcast, to call a friend? I have a friend who I'm the friend she calls when she's in traffic. And she's like, let me sort of like catch up on my connections here. And I don't mind that, right? And so it's accepting the reality of what is, right? This is where I am. Or are you angry? Do you get impatient, right? Do you try to cut people off so you can get into the lane that you think is moving a lot faster? And so it's judging, again, our responses to things that may be outside of our control. When we respond with like patience and grace, right, it actually frees us up to pay attention to other things, right? And so, you know, kind of expanding that analogy, it's if someone is going to be upset with you because you said no, right? Can you live with them being a little dismayed, right? Like, I'm really sorry, right? I would love to help, but I can't. Can you accept that whatever they feel in response to your setting a limit, right, is in no way sort of a characterological flaw, right? Like, oh no, I'm such a horrible person that I said no. What is within your control? You can't, right, dictate the response of another human being, right? So you can even acknowledge like, oh, I'm really sorry. You know, I don't want to disappoint you, but, you know, I have a paper due on Friday and I have this, you know, or maybe not even explaining, just saying, I would really love to help, but I'm so sorry, right? That might be sufficient. And so what Jones also says is complying with the law of limited doability, right? There is a natural law, he says, that we insist on challenging and breaking, which we can never do all that needs doing, right? Again, so this is recognizing the limitations. And he says we resist the law because in our blindness, it seems that submitting to the law comes too close to laziness, to slothness, or negligence, right? And so how do you define productivity? How do you define like being useful to others, right? And does that mean overextending your finite capacity, right? Because that's just not sustainable. Okay. So we're right at 9:30. So I want us to take about a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back and continue. Okay. So 9:40, we'll start again.
Assalamu alaikum. I was just trying to see, can you guys hear me? I've been having problems with my volume.
Hey, Fatin, we're on break right now. Everyone will be back in about 6 minutes.
Oh, good. You can hear me. Okay.
Yeah,
Thanks.
we're good. How are you?
Good. Alhamdulillah. I'm good. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
I'm still here too. This is Tanya. I'm just picking off old nail polish and filing my nails during the break.
Multitasking.
I hope the break came at a good time. um, and I think, again, part of what we can all practice is sort of just allowing space also to do nothing, right? And what does that feel like when we push ourselves just to like sit? So I mentioned to a friend of mine that, you know, I end my internship August 9th, and I'm on a plane to Nevis 8 a.m. the next day, right? And she said, you know what I want you to do? Sit down and do nothing. Don't like over plan and, you know, say you're going to go here and there. And, you know, I said, I just want to eat mangoes and like enjoy being with my cousins, right? But I also know that because of the pace of the year that I've had, that's also going to be like an unfamiliar feeling, right? And it's almost like, wait, I should be doing something right now, right? But what I'm doing is restoring myself, resting, right? And so if we can also include that in the doing, it might be a little bit easier, right, to accept what that sort of restoration time looks like. I actually wanted to go to these questions, these 4 critical questions that Jones kind of posed. Move my. Okay. Question: how do I balance getting to the back of the boat with getting the job done? How do I slow down? What do I tell the critics? And how do I know if I'm doing too much? So I actually wanted to start with that last question. How do I know I'm doing too much? And that is on page 113. And so the signs that Jones offers is the early stage being rushing or busyness, inability to say no, constantly thinking of work, overvaluation of one's own ability, and no days off. Okay. And then the middle stage, he writes, as regularly working more than 40 hours per week. Has anyone tallied like how many hours of work you actually do?
If I told you, it would scare everybody off this line right now. I'm serious.
What's that number?
I'm in a real, well, with the company I work with, since I left California, I literally was home 2 days, and I've been in Oklahoma. I drove 10 hours. I've been working 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week.
Oh.
And this is what I do. 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes you know, every 3 or 4 months. I take contracts, but I have a very interesting situation. I don't even know how I'm able to balance what I am able to balance, but when I drop stuff, I feel like I'm looking to see, well, what needs to change. But as soon as I make those changes, I'm picking everything back up again because I feel like it's a priority. I got to take care of my family. I have to serve the community. I have to do my own freelance writing, my own, you know, so all these things, I'm like, well, you know, I'm just ready to go on Hajj. I'm ready to go. I'm leaving Friday, inshallah. I'm ready to go because I need to there's something that I'm missing, and I'm looking for it, and I'm ready to just not be able to have nobody have access to me, just find me, you know. I'm listening to what's going on, everybody's talking, but I'm also meditating. I'm in my own mind. I have several notes, but don't want to take up the whole class period. But I just thought I should point that out. 84 hours a week, and I'm still serving the community from 600 miles in Oklahoma. Yeah, it's rough sometimes.
And unsustainable.
Yes.
And I have to echo Tyree's sentiments. You know, when I come to Bayan for school, it's like the break for me. And that's 11 hours a day in class. And that feels like an escape for me.
Yeah. I mean, how many of you can relate that when you're away, you're still working, but it feels like a break from work?
Exactly.
Mm.
Absolutely.
Um, and but also if you had to log, right, how many hours you also feel like you spend managing people from afar, right? How many hours would you have to kind of include, right, on top of what that number was before?
You know, for me, I was thinking about it as I started to do the daily. You know, the hours that I listed doesn't really reflect all of those other hours of managing people or taking their concerns with me to bed and waking up with them. You know, so I would say easily 16 hours out of a day, you know, is busy with something other than me, you know. And it's been like that for a number of years.
Okay. What's that number?
I've been, you might say, on this post for 20 years, at least 17 of them.
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness.
Yeah,
So now
yeah, it's crazy.
Can I be slightly dysfunctional and say, like, I completely can relate to what a lot of you are saying. I do feel like sometimes, just like I had mentioned in the last class, I'm never really able to find the balance, but it's like a back and forth, you know, and then sometimes you're like, oh, wow, the kids really are feeling neglected. Okay, let me pay attention to the kids. And then it's like, oh, wow, work is saying or I missed a deadline at school. So, you know, whatever's needed, like immediately you kind of focus on that. But the dysfunctional part is what I want to push back and say is like, great things only happen when there's no balance. Like,
say that one more time.
Yeah.
Amazing things happen when there's no balance. Like if everybody was like, okay, well, I'm taking care of myself, and okay, well, I did my hour of volunteering. Nobody steps up to do anything. And, you know, it's like in some ways yes, we need to talk about this, and yes, we need to find ways and be aware of what we're doing to ourselves. But part of it is, this is part of what calls us to ministry, is that we care so much, and that we are willing to sacrifice some of our sleep and some of our time because we want to build community.
Right.
And you can't build it by yourself.
Right.
Of course. Yes.
So what I would say is that, yes, there will be moments of sacrifice, right? But when those moments become years, right, then it has become something else, right? And thinking about how we overfunction, think of it as we're letting other people's capabilities potentially atrophy, right? They're not flexing their own muscles, right? And so while you may look real swole up top, right, everybody else is just like, nah, I can't really lift any weight. I'll let you do it, right? And so part of the balance, and I think sort of, I don't know if you maybe realize this in sort of the way that you described, it's like, oh, I'll take care of myself. I'll let other people. It is not sort of out of a selfish motivation, right? But of saying that reaching balance is about equity and contribution, right? And so people all have different gifts that they can provide to the community. But if you begin to inadvertently think that you have all of the gifts, right, and people need to come to you, or that you need to somehow be the conductor of the orchestra all of the time, right, then that might, again, not consciously, but it may engender a belief that you are so indispensable. No one else can do what you do, right? That you have to be the person who is at the center of all of activity, or, right, it just paralysis or chaos will break loose, right? And so if there is, and this often, again, think of it as a system, right? We're always in relationship with other people, right? So What happens if we position ourselves as the person who has to clear every single activity, right, before it is done, right? What will happen is that people will start to doubt their own ability, and they'll say, you know what, I think this is what should be done, but let me go ask so-and-so first, right? Now, I'm not talking about like major decisions that you might have to make as, per your role. But if every single, so in what way, because of your role, and if you start to believe in some ways that you're indispensable, you might actually become a micromanager. Right? And so it will cause people to diminish their own capacity and ability because you're always stepping in, right? And so will people make mistakes? Will they do things that you say, the job was done, but I'd prefer that it be done this way, right? Can we tolerate that people will have different strategies, but is the goal being accomplished, right? And so one of the things that Jones points out is that, let's see, what starts to happen in the later stages of doing too much, or in the middle stage, right? Chronic fatigue. And then that can also lead to physical pain. He says emotional deadness and moral and spiritual bankruptcy, right? Because if people are always coming to you for a need, for validation, to be affirmed, when do you have time, right, to connect with the Creator, right? When do you have time to connect with your spiritual nourishment, right? If you're constantly kind of doling it out to other people. But then what also starts to happen is the resentment, right? And maybe we can think of different sort of words to describe this, but the resentment that you start to feel because people are really uncertain, right? You're out of the office for a day and you're like, why did I even take a day off? Because I'm coming back and now, right? Nobody knows what to do. They were all waiting on me, right? And so if you've ever been in a position where, say you're sick unexpectedly, right? You have the flu, right? You're lying in bed, you're trying to rest, right? And you get a call, you get a text, you get an email, right? How many of us have been in that position? Right?
Yes.
And you basically, your body is telling you your emotional fatigue is now starting perhaps to manifest physically, right? So that your immune system is kind of diminished because you're just exhausted, right? And so you say, you know what, I need to take this day off, right? Do you set the boundary and the parameters for the people that you're serving, right? Even just to say, I'm not feeling well. I'm not going to be available between this time and this time because I'm going to need my rest, right? Do we even sort of put those boundaries and set those limits when we're sick, like physically sick, right? Or do you respond to a text, right? Do you respond to an email? What are we doing? Come on, be honest with me.
I think for me, and it's kind of a mercy from Allah that over the last few years I've started to conveniently misplace my phone. Lose it, stuff. If I leave if I leave the house, I don't have it with me. I'm okay with it. If the battery's dead, I'm happy about it. I don't rush to charge it. And those are the moments that I've really used. But over the last year or two, I've been able to say, I'm unavailable. But yeah, losing the phone was the first step towards taking some time for myself.
So it was forced on you at first.
It was, I think it was subliminal, like something subtle happening.
Okay. So Naima just put in the chat that she has 400 hours of sick leave.
Ooh.
Right, sister. 400 hours. How long did it take you to kind of bank that many hours?
About 4 years.
4 years.
Maybe a little more. I don't even know. I just looked up one day and had all those hours. And even when I finally make myself go home or not go to work, instead of healing completely, I'll take maybe a day or two and then go right back to work. So since I saw those hours last year, I was like, I'm not going to keep doing this. It just showed me how neglectful I was of taking the time to really heal.
So now that you have the time to take, have you started kind of regularly scheduling in time that you'll be off?
You know I haven't. Why you ask that question? I've used it as a weapon with the principal. And I'm like, I have these many hours of sick leave.
And you know what they're saying? And you're not going to take them no way. So right.
What? I don't know. I haven't got to that part yet. I just know that, I can tell in my body, that I could just tell, especially last year, that I need to, this year I'm going to work on how to do it. But it's just so hard. I'm like, Rashad, I'll do it. I just don't know how I'm going to do it yet.
Okay. So your community here, we're going to help.
Okay. And my supervisor is really good too. Okay. She'll tell me self-care. For the last 4 years, she's like, when I take a day off, I'll send her a text. She'll just text back self-care. But the principal might say, are you coming in tomorrow? And I'm thinking, wow, I'm off, I'm not well, and you're going to ask me if I'm coming in tomorrow? So that puts the pressure on to say, well, maybe I'll come in later. Let me see how I feel in the morning.
See, so that would give an indication that, again, because you stepped in and filled those roles or that need, that hasn't allowed you said the principal? The principal to function effectively.
Well, she's just all over the place too, though. So, I was thinking about when you say, I could say no, and I'll tell her no. There's some things so whenever I'm not going to be in, I'll send a text to her and my supervisor, because I already know what my supervisor is going to say, and that's going to affect the principal, because the principal knows that my supervisor is looking at it. But then when I return, or she'll send me in a separate text, when are you going to be back? But she's running all over the place too. And, I was going to make a note when I'm not there, because I'm doing the restorative practices. When I'm not at work, it's seen in the whole school community. So everyone is like, ooh, we're glad you're back. And so that puts that pressure on me.
See, and so that, I think, can become the conundrum, right? Is that when people are just so thankful and they're like, oh, we missed you. Thank God you're back. Things are now finally going to get back on track because you're here, right? That appeals to the ego in us, right? Like, well, yeah, people do miss me. They appreciate what I bring, right? But I wonder how much of that is also they had to, in your absence, step up in a certain way that caused, that challenged them and pushed them outside of their comfort zone. And they're like, no, I don't want to do that, right? Or they might say, like, I don't know how you do this, right? And you're like, because no human being should, right? And so when they're so relieved and so willing to step back once you're in that role again, right? That should also give you an indication that perhaps what you're doing is overwhelming, right? And unsustainable, right? Because they're in a rush. They're like, as soon as you step foot in the door of the office, or like, here you go. Thank God you're back. Bye.
Yeah. And then I'll get a little attitude. I'm like, can I walk in the door? Can I take a breath? Can I get in my office?
And so that again gives you the signal that if they are in such a rush to step out of your shoes, right? Because if they felt like what you were doing was right, I mean, it's challenging, but it's not impossible, right? They wouldn't meet you at the door, right? They would say, you know what? I'm glad you're back. Settle in. I know you were out yesterday. Maybe you have to catch up on a couple emails. You know, let's check in right 45 minutes, right? But no, if they're like, here you go, here's your job back. I don't want it, right? That should also give you some hints. Chris wrote in the chat that when he retired, he was able to leave the entire last year with pay based on sick leave time.
Yeah, I like that though.
Oh.
But you know what? That's so deep. I never thought about that. You know, now I can say no. They know I could say no, and I'll tell them what I'm thinking. And because we have, you know, and if they want something, I'll negotiate. I'm like, okay, now if I do this for you, you know, and they're like, oh, okay. But I never thought about to be so quick to give it back to me is an indicator of how difficult it really is, and that I'm using that level of difficulty as a barometer of if I'm doing well and if I'm not. And it's really that the weight of it is so heavy that no one else wants to bear it.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you. I didn't look at it like that.
There you go. And so you asked the question, right? So how do I slow down, right? I have 400 hours of sick leave, right? And what Joan says is it's one thing to be told that you need to slow down and relax more, and moreover to know that you need to do so, and it is another thing to actually do it, right? And so he says, first you must engage and keep engaging in the battle of beliefs, right? So what beliefs or core beliefs do you have about what it means to rest, right?
Let me listen.
So one of the points that he makes here is if you're resting, or if you're kind of removed from being the center of, right, keeping whatever action is in motion, right? Like I need to be there to kind of keep the congregation going. I need to be there to make sure things are running smoothly, right? I would actually, and you guys can challenge me on this, I would say that if that it is not evidence, excuse me, of good leadership if you have not begun to train someone to do what you do, right? If you have not begun to sort of share in some of that responsibility, then can you really say that you're an effective leader, right? Because an effective leader would not leave their congregation, the people that they serve, sort of in chaos if something were to happen, right? Like no day is guaranteed to us, right? And so think about what would happen tomorrow if, you know, God forbid, only you know, God knows when our time is up, right? What would happen to the people that you serve? Right? Or let's not even push it to death. If you were incapacitated in such a way that you had to take a leave of absence, that you had no choice, right? What would happen? Like starting right now, you could not go back to your office. You could not go back to the mosque, the church, right? You had to take the leave immediately per doctor's orders. What would happen?
Things would continue. I mean, I was in a situation where I was injured in between some boys fighting, and I was injured, and I had to take almost, you know, a month off, and everything continued. But I think in the, you know, sort of that on one side of the mind is you have to keep your livelihood going as well. You want to be proficient It's like what Shazia said, it's like, and it doesn't mean, I agreed with her, but, it's like, how do I, so when I was doing, let's just say, for example, when I was doing that week charting, and I did it while at Bayan, and I looked at it, and I realized that there wasn't a balance. That's why when you said that balance is equity and contribution, that really resonated with me. That, I have to be able to perform the task, the mentor, and be a mentor and a mentee, so that if I'm not there or wherever I am, that I can, when I get ready to transition to another area, either in this life or the next, that that is smooth.
Yes.
Because you have to keep paying your bills. I mean, like, so even with Bayan, like, doing the homework, and then trying to look at your own life to sustain it, finding enjoyment. You're just like juggling these balls. And if you don't have a good grip on them or have the rhythm of how to juggle it, then things start to collapse. So I'll just say, finally, what I really appreciated, it didn't dawn on me when you asked the last question when we were to go back and look at, what we jotted down for our week and the time, what one was the quality, where was the quality? And then the other one is like, what's missing? Right. And I was thinking, well, wow, I was able to see from that what's missing. And then it said, and why is it missing? And it really got to the core of, how to move into this new academic year so that those 400 hours I can use without it, I can use them understanding that I need to take time off and don't think a day will just work. But in conjunction with that, plan my day out so that I'm not trying to do things in the morning and at the end of the day when my energy is different than midday. And then I won't set myself up in these scenarios where I get, burned out and stressed out.
Right. Exactly. And so, and so it's okay to acknowledge, right, that you have to function in a certain way, right? But again, usually if that is time limited, right? So you say, here's just crunch time for everyone. So we're all kind of stretched pretty thin. That's one thing. But if you're working in such a way, right, that you're actually, I'll say it this way, if you're over functioning, if you're not allowing space, right, for other people to step up, right, are you smothering the people that you serve? Right. Sometimes we think like we're actually being of great benefit and, we want to be of service, but are we smothering them? Right? Are we enabling certain irresponsibility? Right? Or are we preparing them to say that, many of you may have heard the term like many hands make light work, right? And so if everyone is contributing in a certain way, then everyone can arrive at whatever that goal that has been accomplished feeling pretty good, right? But if you feel like I'm the only one that truly has skin in the game because I'm the only one that's working, 120 hours a week, right? Whatever you accomplish may not be fully appreciated, right? I mean, they might be grateful, might be, acknowledged, like, thank you so much. But how might the people that you serve, your congregation or what have you, how might they be, sort of demonstrate greater investment in their own growth and development if they had space to step forward?
I think everybody seems to be overwhelmed. And so, I mean, as I was listening, sort of projecting, at work, what the scenario looks like, it's like everybody is like burning the candle on both ends. And it's like finding that balance amidst everybody. I haven't figured out how to do that. So it's almost like, I do my job and I'll do my job well and I work in that area. And then I know others are doing their job and You know, but they're exhausted too. Everybody's exhausted. I mean, like, looks like online right now. Or even Enrique. Look what Enrique said at this point about how he defines sick leave as emotional leave.
So that tells me that if everyone is burnt out, then there is a culture, right, that has been created within the organization that demands that people live without limit, right?
Good
And
point.
that there are consequences if you don't.
Okay.
So then it's not simply like, okay, each individual needs to set greater boundaries, right? Organizationally, how is that culture sort of inculcated from the top down?
Good point. Thank you. I'm going to take that because this year I want to focus a little bit differently, thematically on the school and the culture. And that's a great point I want to bring to the table.
Right. I mean, say, for instance, you're in a school. One, I already mentioned that sometimes schools start actually earlier than like the natural rhythm of children. And so if, say, at the end of the day, they're just, not paying attention or distracted, given, certain maybe material that has to be covered. But if you're modeling people resting, right, and caring for themselves, it could be saying, you know what, let's all get up and stretch, right? Like, we've had a really long day. So just naming, right, what it is, instead of saying like, sit down, pay attention, finish this assignment, right? And so are we contributing to a culture? And sometimes, again, like, if you're the leader, if you're the person who's setting the pace, right? And for this reason, I do like to watch cycling, right? Competitive cycling. There's usually someone who sets the pace and everyone else has to keep up, right? But the way in which they keep up is what's called like riding in their slipstream, right? And so while you're kind of setting the pace pretty rigorously, right, there are other people that are using kind of the space that you create to coast.
Sure.
Right? And so it's a difference if people are taking turns, right? And so perhaps on day one, you're the leader, you're setting the pace, it's pretty rigorous, but it's not, overwhelming. And so you can kind of fall back and rest a little bit, right?
Yes.
And then someone else moves forward, right? But what often happens, if the person at the head of that group of cyclists, right, is asked to stay in that position, right, it is, again, you won't win. It is unsustainable, right?
I think that's a beautiful analogy. In fact, that's what the geese do. One always falls back and then another takes lead. Thank you. So beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, so think of it in terms of being a leader, right? And so one of the things, I'll share one of the things that I've done with the fellowship program that we started is the program coordinator. Her name is Aya. She's brilliant, right? She has her bachelor's from University of Pennsylvania. She got her law degree from Harvard. She got a master's in public administration from Princeton. She is brilliant, right? And what I've intentionally done, right, is said, when people make demands of me, or they're, wanting to know something about the fellowship and about this, I said, you know what, I'm going to connect you to Aya, right? And she'll be able to explain kind of, the program overview if you have additional questions. If I received an invitation to attend a certain gathering, I say, well, I'm not available, but I would love to send Aya in my place, right? She's incredible. She's great. And so for me, it was how do I, again, acknowledge other people's gifts and contributions, but also make it such that the program doesn't revolve around me, right?
Okay.
It is truly a team effort. And so things like all of the cogs in the wheel should not stop if I'm not present, right? That means that I'm not doing something well, if that is, And so the challenge that we have to confront within ourselves is, am I overcommitting because I'm afraid of feeling irrelevant? Right? Am I overcommitting because my need, right, my sort of emotional need is being met by feeling indispensable?
So you can keep your job.
So there's a difference between keeping your job and doing well, right? Like, I mean, I'm sure each person wants to, complete their task and complete it with integrity.
Yes.
But again, if you're doing things without limit, you're not saying no, you're not taking care of yourself, right? That is not for your job. Now you're going above and beyond.
Okay.
Rewriting the expectations of your job.
Oh, good point. Alhamdulillah. Shukran. I see a lot of people saying stuff in the chat room, so I'm in the backup. Rashad and Enrique.
Okay, so Rustin is saying, I've been attending BAM full time every semester and working 12 hours per day. I think this is why this has been the toughest semester. I'm taking 3 classes. They aren't hard. I'm just burnt out and feel chronic fatigue and in constant pain. To add to that challenge, I'm given more to do at the masjid because there's no one else that the imam can go to on a consistent basis. So how do I change that dynamic? I think if I start with sitting down and really doing an assessment of what do people do well, right? And how many people might be hiding their own gifts because they're like, you look a hot mess and I don't want to look like you. So I might pretend that I am not as capable as I am, right? Because I know once I step forward, I know once I say, yes, I can do this, I'm going to become perhaps the go-to person, right? So I think it might take everyone saying like, well, what do we do well, right? What am I doing that is actually perhaps not the best use of my skill, right? And so I think the last class I gave the example of the conference, the Black Muslim Psychology Conference, right? So I'm the main organizer, right? I should not be printing out name tags, right? Is that a good use of my time, right, as an organizer? No, right? And so knowing that there are roles that people can take on, and we're trying to assign, again, as much as possible, what is your strength, and let's pair that with your responsibility, right? But again, we have to give up some of, I think initially, before we feel burned out, right, we have to kind of admit to ourselves that there's a part of us that likes to be needed, right, that likes to feel indispensable, right? And it is not until that validation around the indispensability becomes a burden that we're like, oh, wait a second, right? Why am I the only person working around here, right? Everybody else is just like chilling. They're like, oh, this is great, right? And you're the one that's got like sweat on your forehead. You're running around. You're tired. You haven't eaten anything, right? If we are always in relationship to other people, right, we can't put blame on the other person. We may have contributed to a dynamic, right, such that we have not communicated any boundaries whatsoever, right? We have not communicated what our own limitations are, right? And so if someone, if you're holding, say 50 pounds, right, and someone drops 2 pounds on top of it, you may not feel it, right? But what happens if 10 people drop 2 pounds on top of what you're already holding? Now you're going to feel it, right? And so part of being able to set the limit and thinking about how can I slow down, right? I think the what's related to that is, what do I tell the critics? Right. So this is what Jones says on page 111. Right? Some people in our hyperactive culture perceive slowing down and resisting overload as negligence. Right. And so they may feel, maybe even feel jealousy, right? How dare you set limits when I can't, right? Or I won't. They might think, well, I think it was Tanya that mentioned saying no, and people are like, well, you're always the person that helps me, right? So thinking about when you start to change the pace, right, you start to slow down, what do you need to communicate, right? And so what are some of the beliefs that you then have to give up about indispensability, the beliefs that you have to give up about, I'm the only person who can do this well, right? And so what would it mean for you to step back and to say, what would happen if everyone here that I'm serving, right, we're serving each other, what would happen if each person tapped into their gifts and contributed, right? Or are you standing in the way of people being able to acknowledge what their gifts are, and instead sort of engendering this expectation of paralysis, of immaturity, that you will overfunction, and that you will overfunction with no complaint, right? So in what way might you be contributing to a culture that's actually toxic for you, right? In terms of the sustainability of your service. Okay. Any just reactions, comments, thoughts? I know this is a lot because we're trying to think like what's that first step that I take maybe to kind of give a little space to think about how you change the pace of your work. But any thoughts?
That was a lot to take in towards the end, but it was a lot because I feel like it's speaking some really profound truths that at least I personally think I needed to hear. Is that like a lot of the reasons why I think I fall into these traps that I set up for myself of always saying yes or not being able to allow myself to really rest is in part because I think I've internalized some of the unhealthy things I've learned, which is that I'm only as good as much as I can produce. Or the other way is that it's a sign of strength for people to rely on you. And that you should feel good and proud that you're able to, despite how exhausted you are, despite of having 2 young children that you care for and rely on you a lot, especially at this age, that you push forward and you set that example. Like it's a sign of strength. And so then I've somehow taken on this identity of strength when it's to my own detriment, and then I perpetuate it for myself, and I don't want to teach that to my daughters either, that to be a strong woman is to be able to take on everything and do it with a smile. And so I think it's a lot to process, but it's important to shatter those things, I think, internally, because I feel like I did somehow get caught up in that, like, oh, well, I'm so strong, and people tell you you're strong and that that's a sign of strength. But I mean, that's why I fell into the depression that I did, is because of how I wasn't living within my, humanity, which is that I can't fill every need. But I think it's really kind of reaffirming a lot of things that I need to, and that's what's kind of scary, because it's like, well, if you let go of that as strength, how do you rework an idea of healthy strength? And if balance is what's been kind of painted as being a weakness, right? For you to take care of yourself, or to say, I can't do that, or actually I'm tired. It's like, how do you put that in your brain without feeling weak somehow? I don't know. It's a lot to take in, but good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, and thank you for sharing that. Enrique put in the chat that the problem is to find things not getting done and others not stepping up. And this is the dilemma we face as leaders, that we think we have to do it, right? And so I would say to that, if you find something not getting done, right, before you rush to fix it, asking folks why they believe it's not getting done, right? Like, and so instead of resolving the problem, enlisting people and diagnosing what the problem is, right? And so it could be, well, it didn't get done because we didn't have proper instructions, right? We didn't know where to start. We didn't want to step on your toes, right? Or that seems to be your job and we didn't want you to think that we could take your job away from you, right? And so we also have to begin to understand what we might be sending what's called like double bind messages, right? That as we ask for help, we're also saying, no, I got this, right? Is that part of what we're communicating? So it's conflicting. When we find that things aren't getting done, again, part of the self-reflection is, have I subconsciously set it up so that, and I'm going to think of a way to word this clearly, but have I set it up such that no one could do my job so that I could say, see, nobody can do what I can do. Right? Does that make sense?
Makes a lot of sense, yes.
Right. And so that reinforces the belief that we already have. And so perhaps it's, I didn't communicate it well enough, or maybe, it's kind of, I don't know if any of you have ever asked somebody for a recipe and they left out like an ingredient. Right. And so they're like, I followed all of the steps you gave me and it just didn't taste like yours. Right. And you're like, yeah, I know, because I didn't give you the whole thing. And so in our role as leaders, are we, perhaps subconsciously, I don't think intentionally we're doing this, but are we contributing to the dependency, right, of the people that we serve because we have not given up the myth of indispensability, right? And so how would you feel one day if, you gave out the instructions, you said, okay, this person has been identified for this task, this person has this responsibility, and you came in, right, unannounced, and things were running like a well-oiled machine, right? Would you be happy, right? Or would you be a little sad? Like, oh, nobody missed me, right? Or they don't need me here? Namet says she would feel good. I think you would feel little turns like,
no. You don't know how many times I'm like, I'm quitting. I wasn't going back this year. It's like,
I'm gonna have to challenge you. I think, because you said it a couple times, I think you might threaten folks with removing yourself, but they know you're not gonna do it. They're like, this sister has 400 hours banked. She not going nowhere.
But you know what? I didn't even know. If I would have knew, because now I'm like plotting on it. I'm like, 400 hours. Let's see.
Take it.
How can I use this?
If you said something like let's say every 3 weeks, every 21 days.
Okay.
You will take a day, right? So start out small, maybe, but you will take a day, right? And that becomes part of your routine. People aren't surprised. They have more than ample time to prepare for it, right? And that becomes a day where you can recharge.
Okay.
Right? And then they will have to figure out, how do we continue to function knowing that she will be unavailable on a consistent, right? Every 3 weeks, every 2 weeks, whatever. She will be unavailable. So then it pushes them to figure out how they can become more competent. Right? Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Okay. So I'm aware of our time, since we're talking about time, and I want to be respectful of yours. Is we're right at 10:30. So what I want you all to do as you think about completing the shape of your daily life, right, is to also include in some of your reflection, right? What did it? I think one of the questions was, even noting like what you think your week looked like, right? And then what actually, right, what you were actually able to see as far as the pattern, right? Was there a wide sort of disparity between what you imagined and then what the reality was, right? So some things to think about. If there are an overwhelming number of activities that drain your energy, right? What might be a way that you can begin to shift that, right? Even slightly, right? Because these habits might be years and years in the making, right? So I'm not saying after one activity, you're going to be able to completely wipe the slate clean and start over. But what might be one shift, right? It could be one activity on one day that you decide, you know what? This is time that I'm going to set aside for me, either in devotion and worship and meditation, right? And I'm going to guard it because it is critical to me being successful. Okay. Any last thoughts before we close for this evening? No? Okay.
Well, I think you've given us so much to think about, in this, especially the idea of just the culture of an organization and how that shapes our thinking. And I made some comments in the notes about just having role models like Malcolm X that said, don't worry about how much you carry and pray to Allah for stronger shoulders. And those are, and if you look at what he did, he was a trailblazer, and if you have those kind of role models, even Imam Worthy Muhammad, every week he was somewhere different. I mean, he was all the time traveling across the country, around the world, he was always, and these are just, role models that we had that, I think one of the things is just this, I had to understand when I was looking at like when I spent the time in Jacksonville, Florida as the imam, and I started working with other churches. I kind of, and I took this from Imam Muhammad because he established a relationship with the folkloric community, which was outside, it was a Catholic community. And we started doing things with them. Well, I kind of took that strategy and started working with a community action network. But one of the things I did was the AME church was very involved. And then when I started just thinking about their history, and they would have celebrations of 150 years or something, it started making me realize these people have been around for a long time. These establishments, these institutions didn't grow overnight. We're trying to build institutions and we want them to grow right away, overnight, and I say overnight, even 20 and 30 years is a small bit of time.
Right.
And we're trying to, in some ways, compete with those kind of institutions. And as well, seeing the Emirate Muslims being able to put messages up, in 2 years. They come, you have a fundraiser, raise $10 million, put a masjid up, and we're struggling to raise 2,000, 20,000, that kind of money. We built a masjid in Sacramento. It took us over 10 years to raise $200,000 so we could match a gift that somebody gave us of $200,000. Alhamdulillah, the masjid is built, it's there. But I think the challenges that we've had have, I made a mention also, my mother and father never took off time for sick. They went to work sick. So, that set a pace for us, to think you're not supposed to take off. You're sick, you're still supposed to be functioning. But that was because they didn't have sick leave.
Right.
Things like that. So anyway, that's some closing thoughts.
Yeah. So what I want to say to tie to that is, in our core beliefs, understanding how our family of origin, right, our communities kind of contribute to some of those beliefs that might actually now be counterproductive. And also a good friend of mine, Donna Austin, she talks about the Messiah model of leadership, right? So this idea that you have that salvation or liberation will come because of the charisma and the influence and the power of an individual, right? And so we might, you know, in what ways do we see ourselves, right, as that Messiah-like person, right, who will solve all of the problems? Because even when we point to Malcolm X, right, in his example, have you read the letter that he wrote to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, right, about some of the difficulties he was having with his wife Betty, right? It's because he was living without limits, right? And she was like, excuse me, you might be Minister Malcolm out in the world, right? But I got all these babies, right? We never see you, right? And so when we even look to those that we want to emulate, how might they have also, right, modeled ways of being in the world that were just not sustainable, right? And so we can accept their leadership and their brilliance, and also begin to think about how do we pull in our own kind of sphere of influence, how do we pull in more people? And think of it this way: how can we pull in more people to engage their own gifts, right? That God, if we believe this, that God has given everyone a gift, a talent, right, a contribution, how are we cultivating those gifts and those contributions, right? So that when we do, like, raise that, finally, that amount of money, and we can establish a mosque or an organization, everyone present will feel like they have invested, right? Not just like, oh, thank you, Enrique, for all of your service, right? But everyone will be able to come and say, look at what we've done, right? And so it might take acknowledging where we have to take a step back, care for ourselves so that other people can step forward, right? And begin to also care for the community in a really profound way. So think about, you know, as you sort of kind of integrate and write up your reflection papers, you know, with an eye towards hope, right? As burnt out or overextended as you might feel, you didn't get that way overnight, right? It was a gradual process. And so we want to begin to shift things ever so slightly so that you can get into balance, so that your work, your commitment, your service can actually be maximally effective. Okay. So I wish everybody a good night. Thank you for participating, for engaging. And we will have our next online meeting next Monday, August 5th, and I'll make sure I'll send a reminder.